Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
I'm going to begin today with one of the great moments in the history of statesmanship. I guess it'd be better called a trigger warning. If you wanted to forget the 2020 first presidential debate, I'm going to drag you back to it kicking and screaming to introduce this episode.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name.
White supremacists and
who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing.
FBI director
This is a left-wing problem.
White supremacist. Antifa's an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you got to be
not
kidding.
militia. That's what his
it's an idea.
FBI director said.
Well, then you know what?
No, we're done, sir. We're moving on to the next. We're moving.
If that hits you over the head, that's not an idea.
Everybody in
Antifa
your
is
administration
bad.
tells you the truth has a bad idea.
Can I tell you what?
You have no ideas.
Antifa is a dangerous,
All right,
radical
gentlemen,
group.
we're now moving on to the Trump and
you ought to be
Biden
careful
records.
with them. They'll overthrow you.
When a
in 2
president,
seconds.
I don't know why that last part about overthrowing you two always reminds me of this.
And if you don't believe it, then you better kill me now. Because I'll put a jihad on you, too.
Actually, in all of that shouting back and forth, there were some terms that do help introduce the topic for today's episode. Today's episode was supposed to be about one of the dumbest things ever, because that's the series I'm doing. And the specific topic was the Great Leap Forward. If you don't know what that is, that's an Orwellian kind of name for what really should be called the Great Crash Downward. One of the worst state-sponsored catastrophes in the history of the world, if not the worst. So there's obviously something to look forward to there. But today I want to talk about some of the terms that Trump and Biden are arguing about in that first debate. Specifically today, I want to talk about fascism and Antifa. Now, you might be wondering how I got from the Great Leap Forward to fascism and Antifa, and I have to explain that. The Great Leap Forward occurred in the late 1950s and early 1960s under the Communist Party Chairman Mao. So in order to set the stage for the Great Leap Forward, I had to talk about Mao Zedong. In order to do that, I had to talk about Chinese communism. To do that, I had to talk about communism in general, which of course took me all the way back to what communism was a reaction against, which is capitalism. And of course, as you're doing this political theory research, left-wing and right-wing come up again and again, far left, far right. And so at some point, I realized that I kind of understand what these terms mean, but I don't know why they mean what they mean. So as I looked into that, a nice fat red herring got dragged across my path, and I have to admit I followed it off the trail. And where that trail led me is the subject of today's episode, fascism and Antifa. I think they're dangerously relevant, because these are terms I've heard again and again over the past 4 years, and especially around this election cycle. They're terms that generate a lot more heat than they do light. Calling somebody a fascist is just a general term of derision, just kind of like calling them a bully, or a dictator, or a racist. So I think before throwing the term around, it would be important to know what it means. So today I'm going to start with just a general discussion of left and right, and then start at the far right, that's where most people place it, the far right of the political spectrum, and talk about fascism. Let's talk about left and right. These are symbolic terms now, but they actually have their origin in a physical reality. They date back to the late 18th century during the French Revolution. The actual seating positions in the French National Assembly were that on the right side of the parliamentary president sat the monarchists, those who supported the rule of royalty, who wanted to conserve the status quo, hence conservative. They wanted to give the people far less of a voice in their own governance, thinking that the masses, the mob, had no business governing itself. On the left side of the parliamentary president sat the revolutionaries. Far from wanting to conserve the current social order, they wanted to overthrow it. They wanted to abolish the royalty and all class distinctions and see all people equal. According to Evan Andrews on the History.com website, the split dates back to that summer of 1789, when the members of the French National Assembly met to begin drafting a new constitution. The most divisive issue in that assembly was how much authority King Louis XVI should actually have. As the debate raged on, the two main factions staked out territory, physical territory, in the assembly hall. The anti-royalist revolutionaries seated themselves to the presiding officer's left, and the conservatives, the aristocrats, seated on the right. According to one aristocrat, quote, "I tried to sit in different parts of the hall and not to adopt any marked spot so as to remain more the master of my opinion. But I was compelled absolutely to abandon the left or else be condemned always to vote alone and thus be subjected to jeers from the galleries." End quote. So in other words, even if he didn't want to just form a faction on the right, he wanted to be independent and sit wherever in the hall he wanted to. As soon as he voted in opposition to the leftists, he would be shouted down and jeered at. So he found himself naturally gravitating toward those who agreed with him in the physical space to the right of the parliamentary president in that assembly hall. And that was probably the experience of many people, on the left and right. They didn't want to be necessarily pigeonholed into one group or the other, but they found themselves force-teamed into the left and right based upon their votes and based on the jeers and the pushback they got from people around them. For their own safety and protection, they sat with people who they agreed with. And I hate to say it, but in the community of public and political opinion, this still takes place, maybe not at the physical level, but when people attempt to cross the aisle, that's the expression we use because it comes from that same assembly. When you try to cross the aisle and reach out to somebody on the other side, you can wade into some fairly uncomfortable territory and get pushback from both sides, frankly. So French newspapers picked up on this, and all through the 1790s, the newspapers made reference to the progressive left and the traditionalist right. And by the mid-19th century, so in the mid-1800s, left and right had entered French vernacular. And the terms even became more defined, so you had center-left or center-right if you were a little closer to reaching across the aisle. Terms far-left and far-right came to symbolize the people who were so steeped in their ideology that they would be tucked far into the right or left corner of the assembly hall, far away even from the main body of their own ideology. So there's far left, far right, center right, all referencing back to actual seating positions in the French National Assembly Hall. So these terms were common on the continent, but they didn't make their way to Great Britain or the United States till the early 20th century. Now the terms are used, of course, to describe the opposing ends of the political spectrum in the United States, just like they were in France. But their origin is still evident because even in the United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans sit on opposite sides of the House and Senate chambers. Maybe to prevent breaches of decorum, I guess. Fistfights, shouting matches, hair pulling, all of which happen from time to time in almost any legislative body. So to this very day, the right or rightists favor a strong executive branch. The aristocratic, the nobility, the wealthy classes get to hang on to their status and their money, mainly through low taxation. The money does not get redistributed to the masses. And there's also an interest on the right in maintaining or conserving societal standards in academia, music, theater, morality, religion, etc. And to some extent, to this very day, leftists or the left favor equality for all people. They want to weaken or abolish privilege, to take some of the resources of the wealthy and distribute them to the underprivileged so that more equality exists in society. This is why they favor a strong safety net and social programs. And they're less inclined to see the existing social order as desirable, and instead favor progressive social change such as abolishment of the death penalty, legal abortion, etc. Probably the best, broad, and oversimplified definition of left and right, if you want that. comes from Roderick Stackelberg, the former professor of history at Gonzaga University. He said this, quote, "The more a person deems absolute equality among all people to be a desirable condition, the further left he or she will be on the ideological spectrum. The more a person considers inequality to be unavoidable or even desirable, the further to the right he or she will be," end quote. Now, I know that can sound like a condemnation of the right, but that's not how he intended it. He's just pointing out the fact that it's not that inequality is desirable according to the people on the right. It's just that it's inevitable. It's the way things are, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. So when you see it this way, it does help explain a lot of the policy positions that people on the left and right favor. So how do you level the field if you're on the left? How do you bring equality to all people? Well, you tax the rich at a higher rate. You support a strong public education, so even poor people have access to a good education. You spend money on public projects, provide medical care and a secure retirement for classes that have worked all their lives and hadn't made a small fortune in their savings. So essentially, take some of the money rich people have and give it to people who are underprivileged. Provide a safety net in the form of social welfare. You ensure access to higher education for underprivileged people by affirmative action type program. If you are on the right and you think that inequality is the natural state of affairs, even a desirable state of affairs, we don't want to try to equal everybody, then how does that value play out in policy? Well, you lower capital gains taxes and other income taxes. You reduce spending on programs like retirement, government health care, public schools. None of those things are necessary for wealthy people. They can afford them on their own. What wealthy people need is safety and security and a stable society. And so for this reason, to this very day, the right is associated with strong police force and a strong military, protection from threats, domestic and foreign, conservative judges, harsher prison sentences, all of those things that would lend to the stability of the society they live in, that they thrive in. So this distinction, left and right, these are the two great horns, at least of the American political system and European politics. And when you look at seemingly inscrutable decisions in this light, suddenly they make sense. Now, like most things, these are not rigid dichotomies. Most citizens are somewhere near the middle, what they call center-left or center-right. If they were in the French National Assembly, they would be seated near the aisle that ran down the middle. Even people on the right today favor some social safety net. They favor Medicare and Social Security programs, at least pay them lip service. And even the Democrats on the left are not in favor of this total income redistribution. In fact, they use terms more like, we want the wealthy to pay their fair share. They also favor a strong, stable society, which has traditionally been associated with the right. So despite all accusations to the contrary, and for better or worse, there are very few doctrinal purists in the Congress of the United States. And even if they're there, it is politically fraught to admit it. But it's just those purists, those far to the left, far to the right people that I want to consider next. And I want to begin with those on the far right, because that's where most political theorists would put fascism. Communism's far to the left, fascism far to the right. So what is fascism? It's a word that's often misused today, and apparently it always has been. As far back as 1944, George Orwell, writing in World War II, said, quote, "The word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist," end quote. As recently as 2005, Professor Richard Griffiths of the University of Wales wrote, "Fascism is the most misused and overused word of our times." And I think it's clear. This word is thrown around all the time because it has kind of an explosive, very negative meaning. So if you want to denounce somebody, if you want a pejorative, then you use fascism, quite often when their ideas don't even have much to do with the ideas or the political movement of fascism itself. And I think this overuse of the word weakens its effect, dilutes its meaning. Assuming fascism is an actual thing, let's try to figure out what it is. Even though fascism, in most people's minds, is always associated with Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, it actually began in Italy. The word fascism itself actually comes from the Latin word fascio, which just means a bundle or sheaf, a group of sticks wrapped together. As a symbol, as a little piece of political imagery, it had a long history going all the way back to the Roman Empire. And its primary symbolic meaning, of course, would be that a single stick can be broken easily, but when you wrap them all together into a bundle, it's very difficult to break. As the image was used in ancient Rome and in medieval Europe from time to time, it usually included an axe tied in with a bundle of sticks. And the axe was to symbolize two things. One is penal authority, the ability of the state to punish offenders, and also their commitment to militant action. So the symbol of a sheaf, a bundle of sticks wrapped together with an axe attached, was adopted by some Italian revolutionaries in the late 19th century. In 1914, Benito Mussolini has turned his back on socialism. He's forming a new political group, and he adopts that symbol. He names his group, and I'm not even going to try the Italian, he names it roughly the Revolutionary Fascists for Interventionist Action. Then in 1919, he creates another group, this time called the Fasci di Combattimento, the Brotherhoods of Combat. And that's a name that carries a lot of meaning for the organization he was trying to create. It is a brotherhood or a fraternity in the sense that it is a male-dominated organization. And combat carries all of the dedication, the glorification of violence inherent in Mussolini's movement. Interestingly enough, since that time, from that time to this, fascism has primarily been a male-dominated system, and it also glorifies aggression. It is, by its very nature, inherently violent. Mussolini goes on to found the National Fascist Party with himself as the dictator, and the symbol he uses for that party is a sheaf of sticks bound together with an axe. So that's where the word comes from. Now, of course, since that time, there have been a lot of leaders and political systems characterized as fascist. They're all different, of course, but they do share some common characteristics. One of their hallmarks, one of their most defining characteristics, is an extreme militaristic ultra-nationalism. So a lot of flag-waving, a lot of aggression, a lot of red-faced, testosterone-fueled bluster about what they're going to do to their enemies inside and outside of the state. That's the spirit of fascism. But of course, that's not enough. Any country at war might evidence similar behavior. So along with that ultra-nationalism, they also have a general contempt for electoral democracy. In fact, they don't like leftist ideas at all because they believe in a natural social hierarchy, the rule of the elites, the creation of a Superman class or an Overman class, or lauding things like the native sons of Spain, or the noble Aryan race of Germany, or the true Italians, which of course is another key point about fascism. It isn't just sexist, it's racist in general. Why is that? Well, you have to create an us versus them. And race is the most convenient, the most visible manifestation of separation between peoples. So whereas democracy might be concerned with helping different groups of peoples live together, work together, and blend and so forth, fascism is concerned with purity, and that's usually racial purity. Fascists are usually preoccupied with trying to throw everyone but the pure race out of the nation, or at least to ensure that the rulers only come from the approved pure race. Something that helps me remember the key points of fascism is to turn the first three letters of the word fascism, F-A-S, into an acronym. And each of those letters stands for two key points. So for F, I have fatherland and fight. Fatherland because, as I said, fascism tends to be ultra-nationalistic. So fatherland emphasizes the fact that fascism is anti-foreigner, anti-immigration, often very racist, preserving the supposed racial purity of a given nation. Fatherland also emphasizes to me another fascist trope, the idea of this golden age of former glory from which your nation has fallen. Some enemy has wormed its way into the nation and must be rooted out. Impure books have to be suppressed, which usually means they are destroyed or burned or censored. Impure people have to be suppressed or thrown out to restore the fatherland to its former greatness. And all of the ideas that weaken the nation, ideas like the equality of all people or democracy, ideas of social welfare, all of those ideas are enervating. They take the energy from the nation. If you're going to restore the lost status, the lost glory of a nation, if you're going to make it what it once was again, then you have to suppress all of those ideas. So F is for fatherland. And as I said, F is also for fight, because again, fascists are very militaristic. Nothing gives a fascist that little tingle quite like an intercontinental ballistic missile, or a tank, or a fighter jet. The historian Stanley Payne has described what he calls the fascist style. and that is positive views of violence, promotion of masculinity, youth, and what he calls charismatic authoritarian leadership. The leader becomes a figurehead that is nearly worshipped, and for some reason, as you can probably guess, from the beginning until now, from the earliest to the most nascent fascists, from Mussolini to Hitler to Pinochet and all of them, that figure is always a blustering, aggressive male. So fatherland and fight, but this also brings me to the A of fascism. The A stands for, first, authoritarian, a strong central government, powerful, almost unlimited executive power. That, according to fascism, is the recipe for a strong nation, because only a powerful, an extremely powerful executive can enforce the goals of that society. Democracy is the rule of rabble, according to fascists. The lower class, the lesser citizens, are just not capable of making the correct choices, and if they do, they don't make them strong enough. They don't make them quickly enough. Only a powerful leader, a dictator in other words, can express his will quickly enough and powerfully enough. And because of this, the rights of each individual are nothing compared with the glory of the nation. In fact, in practice, that's how fascism works. Individual rights don't really exist, except as they promote the good of the nation. Now, of course, as I already mentioned, because this leader has so much power, a cult of personality often develops around this leader. It's very hard to have an authoritarian system without a cult of personality. And as a consequence, the fascist leader, like so many other dictators, constantly in their people's face, over the loudspeakers, over the bullhorns, over the airways, in print, at every major national event, they are inflicting themselves on their population. I think one of the best examples of this is the person who I call maybe the 10th worst person in history, Jim Jones. In Jonestown, he was on the loudspeaker all day, every day. His paranoid, drug-addled fever dreams on the poor people living there all day. So the A is not just for authoritarian, it's also for autonomy. Fascist regimes, because of their militaristic bent, are also all for autonomy. They want to be able to control the means of production, to make sure that they're not relying on any other nation for their goods and services. All the manufacturing, all the agriculture should be done from within the nation. That now brings me to the S of fascism. We've talked about F and A. Now the S is probably the most interesting to me. The first S is scapegoating. This is a huge fascist trope. And I already alluded to it somewhat earlier when I talked about the fact that there's this idea of a golden age or a former glory that the nation has fallen victim to someone that has taken that glory from them. And that person or that group of people is the scapegoat. After all, how can you fire up people's outrage, rouse their militarism without an enemy to hate, without somebody to focus it on? And that's why the authoritarian leaders of fascist regimes often spend quite a bit of time focusing their vitriol, their hatred, their resentment, their victimization narratives on some class or group or person that is their scapegoat. Think of all the scapegoat does for a fascist leader. First, it arouses his people's aggression. It outrages them. It mobilizes them to act, whether that's producing more in the factory or physically going out and killing somebody. But not only that, it creates a dependency on the great leader, because only he can save them from this scapegoat, from this enemy. This is how Professor Jason Stanley put it in his book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Quote, "The leader proposes that there are problems that only he, because historically it has always been a he, not a she, can solve, and all of his political opponents are enemies and traitors." End quote. So the prosecutions of political enemies, labeling someone who opposes you as a traitor, suppressing freedom of the press, banning books, are all activities you might find a fascist regime occupied in at any given moment. Of course, most of the time the scapegoat isn't just a political enemy or an opponent. It's an entire class or often a race of people. People who can be portrayed as outsiders. So gypsies, immigrants, Jews. All of these groups and many others have been the targets of fascist scapegoating, often repeatedly. This is how Robert Paxton put it. He said, quote, "Fascism is a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline or victimhood, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants abandons democratic liberties and pursues redemptive violence without ethical or legal restraints." End quote. I love what he says about obsessive victimhood, because authoritarian fascist leaders, even though they have all kinds of power, almost absolute power, You would think they were the most disadvantaged, picked on people you've ever seen in your life. They are always the victim of some machination, some secret plot, some group that is trying to destroy them or trying to prevent the fatherland from achieving its glory. And so we talked earlier about the fascist style. Well, another element besides militarism of that fascist style is that you are always the aggrieved party. You're never being treated fairly. Nobody else plays by the rules. There is a whole group of people or a race or whatever it is that are conniving, that are trying to throw up roadblocks, trying to thwart your every noble aspiration. But the truly scary thing about the fascist mentality is that these scapegoats, these supposed lesser conniving beings, whatever they are not entitled to the same protections under the law as the true race or the true party or whatever it is. So they can be treated any way the state decides to treat them, as enemies of the state. So that's the scapegoating part of fascism. The second part of that S is super race or Superman. That's a group of elites who are destined to rule, destined by race or genealogy, national descent, whatever it is. Let's face it, they're just better than everyone else in the world. They can be entrusted with all the power. And since some of the other things I've talked about touched on this already, I'm not going to beat it to death. But that, in a nutshell, is the ultra-appealing ideology we call fascism.
And if you don't believe it, then you better kill me now.
I have no idea. It must appeal to something primal and tribal in human nature, because I don't get it. In its common iterations, it's typically a super elite, all-powerful dictator victim, peddling a persecution narrative in which their entire nation has fallen from its former glory and has to be restored against the scapegoat, usually by violent means. So I'm going to be honest, I don't get how this message resonates, how people would find it appealing and sign up for some of that good old fascism. But the fact that it does resonate can hardly be disputed. One reason for that might be that fascism is powerful. That can also hardly be disputed. Friedrich Nietzsche is credited with saying, "Pride and hate invigorate." And what is fascism but codified pride and hate? Pride, national narcissism, racial narcissism, and hatred, that's fascism. And that is motivational. That can impel people to act, along with rallying people around a common enemy and a shared goal. We have to admit that a dictator can make decisions more decisively and much more rapidly than a legislative body. That's especially true when there's a threat to face. You can address that threat without committees, no parliamentary hand-wringing, no grandstanding. The authoritarian leader simply makes the decision, and it is carried out. It's not just during times of threats. Think how conducive fascism is to a well-ordered society. In fact, probably very little crime, because fascist states are police states and crimes are punished heavily. If you fear attack by another nation, if you think your livelihood is at stake or your existence is at stake, you might be tempted to adopt fascism, because in fascist societies, the military is emphasized. If you believed that you could see society devolving into chaos around you, with crime and poverty and prostitution and drugs in the street and workers not showing up for their jobs at the factory and the trains not running on time, then fascism offers a profound sense of social order. I believe this is also why the historian Robert Paxson said that the traditional elites, the wealthy and capitalist class, very often support fascist regimes. Because without social order, how do the elites stay elite? And again, this is one of the reasons why fascism is usually placed on the far right of the political spectrum. It does anything but emphasize the equality of all human beings. Usually, in all the world, there's nothing a fascist hates so much as a communist. So there you go for why fascism might be alluring to some people. Powerful leadership, quick decisions, decisive action, uniting of a group of people around a common enemy, strong, stable police states, very little crime, well-defined social hierarchy, or at least order. And so it's very appealing to certain, I would say, personality types, leadership styles, whatever you want to call it. And if it weren't for one or two drawbacks, then I guess fascism might be effective. But unfortunately, those drawbacks aren't so little. To learn about those drawbacks, all we have to do is take a star-studded tour of the fascist hotspots. Most political theorists and historians would agree that the following regimes are fascist, and the most important fascist regimes of the last century and a half. We talked about Mussolini's Italy, Nazi Germany, Franco's Spain, Salazar's Portugal, Papadopoulos' Greece, Pinochet's Chile, and Suharto's Indonesia. Obviously, this list represents a mixed bag of national identities, cultures, different levels of technological and societal development and history, but they all follow the fascist model in how they rise to power and then how they maintain that power. And since every one of these regimes has been overthrown, we have a little bit more complete, non-propagandized picture of how they ran. If you look at the common elements of these regimes, you can see clearly some of the fruits of fascism, how fascist theories translate into the real-world lived experiences of people in these regimes. The author Lawrence Britt put together a brilliant list, in my estimation, of 14 characteristics of fascist regimes. This was published originally in the year 2003 in Free Inquiry magazine, and it has been modified and co-opted by left and right and reprinted hundreds, if not thousands of times. Now, the key thing to recognize here is, Britt is not compiling this list to be normative. It is not a diagnosis of a fascist regime. What it is, and all it claims to be, is a list of several common elements found in these various fascist regimes. So here are Britt's 14 points. Number 1, powerful and continuing expressions of nationalism. We talked about that. But he sees evidence of this characteristic in the prominent displays of flags, lapel pins, a fervor to show patriotic nationalism, to talk patriotic nationalism on the part of the leaders and the citizenry that almost bordered on a frenzy. And this is key. According to Britt, that nationalism was usually coupled with a suspicion of foreign things that often bordered on xenophobia. Number 2 characteristic of fascist regimes, disdain for the importance of human rights. The regimes themselves did not view human rights as valuable or important. Instead, they were more of a hindrance to realizing the objectives of the ruling elite. According to Britt, through the clever use of propaganda, the population was brought to accept human rights abuses. And the way that worked was by marginalizing, demonizing everybody being targeted. That's the scapegoat class. But in all of these regimes, there was a level to which the citizens would not sink. So when the abuse was too egregious, the tactic was to use secrecy, denial, and disinformation. So that's number 2, disdain for the importance of human rights. Number 3, identification of scapegoats and enemies as a unifying cause. This one we've beaten to death. This was the most significant common thread among those regimes we just mentioned, though. The use of scapegoating. Divert people's attention from other problems. Shift blame for any of the ruling class's failures to something else. I love this term that Britt uses. He says, channel frustration in controlled directions. So if the leadership screws up, people are starving to death or dying, whatever it is, then whip the people into a righteous frenzy, of course. Let them get as angry as they want to get, but make sure that you channel that fury on somebody other than the people who are actually to blame. Britt goes on to list many of the targets of scapegoating of these regimes. Communists, socialists, liberals, Jews, racial and ethnic minorities, competing nations, or even traditional enemies of their nation, members of other religions, or no religion at all, so secularists, homosexuals, and terrorists. Anyone who disagreed, especially openly, with the rulership in these regimes was dealt with as a terrorist. They were labeled as terrorists and dealt with in just that way, which usually means execution, whether it's by a cesium pellet in your drink or by a firing squad. Number 4, the supremacy of the military, avid militarism, as we talked about before. The ruling elites always identify with the military. They want to be seen as military leaders. They often don uniforms. They send out propaganda photos of them rubbing shoulders with generals or sitting around planning a battle or heading a giant military parade. And because of this military focus, a huge share of national resources, of industrial output, is devoted to the military, even when times are tough. Instead of feeding some of the underprivileged citizens, they'll devote tremendous amount of resources to their military. Just ask Kim Jong-il, nothing feeds a starving nation like a giant military parade. Number 5, rampant sexism. We talked about how fascist regimes see themselves as a fraternity. So aside from the fact that all of the culture and all of the rulership is male-dominated, fascist regimes historically have looked upon women as second-rate or second-class citizens. All of the fascist regimes that Britt looked into were adamantly anti-abortion and homophobic. And in fact, they had harsh, draconian punishments for being gay or for having an abortion. And Britt points out that whatever the dominant Orthodox religion in the country was at the time strongly supported their anti-gay and anti-abortion stances, and the harsh punishments they affixed to them. So the regime had moral cover for the harsh treatment it gave to certain classes. That shouldn't be surprising, because of course priests, clergy were under the same threat of being labeled traitors and killed as all the other citizens in the regime. Number 6 is what he calls a controlled mass media. Now, sometimes that was direct control. The regime actually programmed content on the mass media. But at other times, it would use labeling or pushback or direct threats to make sure that the media towed the orthodox line for the regime. And as a consequence of this, the ordinary citizens were kept in an astounding level of ignorance about what was really happening in the world around them. Number 7 sounds a lot like the general militarism. That is an obsession with national security. This obsession with national security, though, meant that everything, including human rights, were subverted in the interests of national security. Any amount of abuse or oppression could be justified. I'm not going to go into that anymore. It's pretty obvious. Number 8, characteristic of fascist regimes, separates it dramatically from most communist regimes. And that is that religion and the ruling elite were tied together. They were joined at the hip. Now, this isn't always the case, but most fascist leaders love to portray themselves not only as nationalists, but as ardent defenders of the dominant religion in that nation. Never mind that all of their actions were usually totally incompatible with the tenets of that religion they claimed to defend. Most of the time, the religious leaders of the day would excuse all of their awful behavior by saying that they are the defenders of the faith. And if you attack our fascist leader, you're attacking the very foundations of our religion. That's quite a contrast with what fascist leaders called the godless communists. So that's number 8. Religion and the ruling elite working together to shore up their power. Number 9 is interesting, something you don't notice unless you look for it. That is, in fascist regimes, the power of corporations was protected. So the ordinary citizens were strictly controlled. But corporations, especially large, powerful, rich corporations, could operate with a lot of freedom, a lot of leeway. In fact, it seems that fascist leaders considered their interests and the interests of the economic elite aligned, mostly because they could bring wealth to the nation, they could produce military supplies rapidly, but also as another means of social control. Mussolini himself emphasized this very point when he said this: fascism should more properly be called corporatism, since it is the merger of the state and corporate power. You can't spell it out any more clearly than that. That brings us to point 10. The power of labor was suppressed or eliminated. Fascist leaders, right or wrong, saw organized labor as the one force in the nation that could legitimately challenge their power. Many fascist leaders, despite all their privilege and power, would view the poor and the underclass with suspicion. They thought they were a little too close to communist in their sympathies. So allowing them to organize into labor unions was completely out of the question. That's not part of the program. And any attempt to do so was usually crushed. Number 11 of the fruits of fascism, as we'll call it, was suppression of intellectuals, disdain for the arts, freedom of ideas, open debate. Writers and speakers who can say things in clever ways were anathema to these regimes. As a consequence, especially the universities were tightly controlled, constantly watched over, and turning in your colleague or your professor for subversive thought was rewarded. So, of course, book burnings were common, and to these regimes, there was no reason to read a book, write a book, create a piece of art, compose a symphony, unless it promoted the national glory, unless it told the story the regime wanted told. So, suppression, harassment, or outright elimination of intellectuals and artists was a hallmark of these regimes. Moving on to number 12, obsession with crime and punishment. We already talked about the police state nature of most fascist nations. The police were glorified, and they were almost unchecked in their power. And so, of course, there were rampant abuses in the criminal justice systems. And speaking of corruption, number 13, rampant cronyism and corruption, with very few and very non-robust checks and balances. So if the ruling elite and the corporate elite got together to enrich each other and themselves, nothing would stop it, and that's exactly what happened. You bribe one in the power elite, and they make sure you get that building permit right where you want it. It's hard not to describe these relationships as transactional. But the upshot of all this was, you didn't see any poor people in the power elite in fascist nations. Not when there are so many corporate and national resources to steal from your people. That brings us to the final point in the fruits of fascism. That's number 14, fraudulent elections. Everything from the public opinion polls leading up to the election to the final vote tally was completely manufactured. Even those regimes that bothered to pay lip service to democratic elections would just corrupt the results and get what they wanted out of them. The methods employed to corrupt elections are a little scary. So instead of being accused of putting my own spin on this and trying to somehow poison the well, I'm just going to read from the original article written by Britt back in 2003. This is what he said. Common methods included maintaining control of the election machinery, intimidating and disenfranchising opposition voters, destroying or disallowing legal votes, and as a last resort, turning to a judiciary beholden to the power elite. So there you have it, 14 traits common to fascist regimes. And that according to the famous list, 14 Defining Characteristics of Fascism by Lawrence Britt. It's interesting that before that list came out, there was another list with 14 elements common to fascist regimes, this time from Umberto Eco. And this list from Eco, which he titled Fascism, actually antedated the list by Britt by about 8 years. It also had 14 elements of fascist regimes. And since Eco is a philosopher and semiotician, his list would probably require a little more explanation than I'm going to give it here. It's primarily concerned with the meaning behind fascist symbols. But even at that, even without explanation, I think it's powerful and instructive. So here are some of the characteristics of fascist regimes according to Umberto Eco's list called Fascism. Number 1, the cult of tradition. And into that, I think you would throw all the noble heritage and the golden age talk that fascist regimes are prone to. Number 2, rejection of modernism. So progressive ideas and policies in general, rejected. Number 3, action for action's sake. This one I think is telling and fascinating, of course. They always have to appear to be doing something. Great fascist leaders get up early in the morning and claim to outwork everybody. Have to make a big show of all the stuff that's going on under their regime, even if it doesn't amount to anything. Number 4, disagreement is treason. There's no such thing as an honest disagreement. It's all an attempt to undermine the regime. It's all suspicious. Number 5, fear of difference. And I think that's self-explanatory, whether it's xenophobia, homophobia, contrary opinionophobia, whatever it is, they fear difference. Number 6, appeal to a frustrated middle class, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Number 7, obsession with a plot. And here I think Eco has nailed something important. I don't know if it's the paranoia of the fascist leaders, or if it's an intentional diversion tactic, but they are constantly promoting conspiracy theories. There's always a plot. They see a nefarious hand behind so many actions that could be attributed to much more reasonable causes. Number 8, followers must feel humiliated by the ostentatious wealth and force of their enemies. And I think that's just a fancy way of saying everybody in a fascist regime, from the top leader all the way down, has to feel jealous and resentful of something their enemy has or is. Number 9, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy because life is permanent warfare. Life is warfare. And if you're a pacifist, if you think, hey, maybe we shouldn't assume such an aggressive posture, then you're giving aid and comfort to the enemy. I think really what Eco is saying here is that there is a cult of violence around fascist regimes. Number 10, contempt for the weak. And this ranges from dismissiveness to mockery to cancellation of social programs to outright extermination. Number 11, everyone is educated to be a hero. Now that one requires a little bit more explanation that I'm not going to go into, but essentially, citizens in a fascist regime are taught to see themselves as part of an ongoing epic battle and struggle, or whatever you want to call it, the soul of the nation, the glorious nation. Number 12 is something that many people have pointed out. Umberto Eco calls it machismo. This again, I mean, whether a fascist leader is like 22 or 75, they will emanate pubescent levels of testosterone. Whether they take a picture of themselves with no shirt on, riding a horse, standing in platform heels next to world leaders, sporting a rugged, hardy, outdoorsy look or tan, standing next to a giant missile with tremendous amounts of thrust pointing skyward, fascist regimes and their nations love to portray an image of machismo. Number 13 is selective populism. So these are not primarily populist movements. As we've said before, they often are movements more of the elite. But they do play on populist themes when they suit their needs. And finally, number 14, fascism speaks newspeak. So words mean different things under a fascist regime than they meant before that regime took power. Peace, honesty, nobility, patriotism, all of the terms change under fascist dictators. And I think it's important to point out that we should not throw the term fascist around lightly. It's tempting to call everybody we disagree with a fascist, especially when we see some of those 14 characteristics manifested in various regimes. Where something goes from proto or pre-fascist or employing fascist tropes to full-blown fascism is when it calls for a violent overthrow of the democratic norms of a society. Many political philosophers consider violence the sine qua non of fascism. If you don't have violence, violent overthrow talk, you don't have fascism. So now I want to look at just a few historical examples of fascism in action. What about Chile under Pinochet? 1973, Pinochet rises to power, overthrowing the government of Allende, with, I have to point out, a tremendous amount of help from the United States that didn't like Allende's communism. The first thing that Pinochet's regime does is outlaw all political activities and, in fact, suspend the 1925 Constitution of Chile. All political activity is declared in recess. He then began a systematic campaign of imprisoning, torturing, harassing, and murdering people he perceived as his opposition. Pinochet realized right away that universities were a hotbed of thinking, and so he appointed military leadership over all of the universities. Anyone who wasn't thought to be towing the party line or had a little left-leaning bias was purged immediately. Fired, of course, from their positions, but also often killed or disappeared. Pinochet, with his control over the armed forces, used them to censor the media, arrest opposition leaders, repress demonstrations. In fact, using his military, he essentially shut down all of civil society. He imposed strict curfews. He prohibited public gatherings. He censored the press or shut it down completely. And that wasn't the worst of his outrages by any means. Early in the career of Pinochet, the Caravana de la Muerte, the Caravan of Death, a squad of, essentially, hitmen, boarded helicopters and flew from the south of Chile to the north, killing people along the way. Any prisoners in army custody who were even suspected of having communist leanings were executed by this Caravan of Death. And that's just one example. Between 1973 and 1990, Chile was a nightmare of human rights violations. Gruesome acts of physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, torture, participated in by the military, the police, and anyone aligned with Pinochet. Waterboarding, electric shocks, beatings, and, like we said, sexual abuse. But the most psychologically terrifying thing about Pinochet's regime were the disappearances. People who were even suspected or felt or denounced as possibly being subversive, possibly holding left-leaning tendencies, would simply disappear. Disappear from their homes, from their work, never to be seen or heard from by their loved ones, family, or coworkers again. You can imagine the effect this would have not only on the person who disappeared, but the psychological trauma, the terror instilled in a family or a church congregation or an entire community when people disappeared. It's hard to get an accurate count of how many people were killed or disappeared during the Pinochet years. Early in Pinochet's regime, 3,000 minors were killed who were suspected of having communist or left-leaning sympathies. The historian Rudolf Rummel puts the estimate between 10,000 at a minimum and 30,000 at a maximum. So whatever the benefits of Pinochet's regime in Western friendliness or economic expansion, it's hard to justify it when you have that kind of human toll to achieve those aims. I hardly need to mention the Nazis, so I won't. Suffice it to say, I have an entire episode on the demagogue, the fascist leader Adolf Hitler, who I called the worst human being ever. So let's move on. Let's talk about Suharto, the fascist leader of Indonesia. He also rose to power in a coup, this time against the leader Sukarno. And sadly, once again, the rise of Suharto was aided and abetted by the United States under the auspice of fighting communism. And I will just simply point out, the United States finds itself on the wrong side of history in some of these cases in supporting dictators and brutal butchers. And it's not because the United States valued those ideals. It's because it considered communism an existential threat. In the case of Indonesia, it had recently just emerged from Dutch colonial rule. And that's a topic for another day. You know, we don't usually associate human rights abuses with the Dutch, with the Netherlands. But Indonesia was a pretty sad case example. So after they shrug off Dutch colonial rule under their leader Sukarno, to the great consternation of the United States, Sukarno begins to forge closer ties with Mao and Castro and North Vietnam and North Korea. And that's when Suharto and his allies engineer a takeover. They overthrow Sukarno in a coup. As soon as Suharto comes to power, he sets himself to the task of healing his wounded nation. Since there was no Brené Brown at the time, he was left to his own devices, so the way that Suharto chose to heal his wounded nation was described by the Sydney Morning Herald in 1999 as, quote, carrying out one of the greatest massacres of civilians in the 20th century, end quote. In 1999, the Sydney Morning Herald published a 3-part series that included interviews with Indonesian political prisoners, extracts from documents obtained from, get this, United States and Australian archives about what was going on in Indonesia. According to these internal documents, with the full knowledge of these Western governments, the Suharto regime carried out the murder of between 500,000 and 1 million people it considered enemies, and these were essentially of 2 groups. One group was the PKI, the Communist Party members, but the other group was just ethnic Chinese. And of course, when you're killing that many people, there's the usual laundry list of outrages that goes along with it. Now remember again that this is a Sydney Morning Herald. This is an Australian newspaper reporting this. But between 1965 and 1966, under Suharto, and with apparently the knowledge of Western powers, army units were working with Muslim groups in Indonesia to shoot, hack, or club to death 1,500 people a day, sometimes parading their heads on sticks. That was just the early accomplishment of Suharto's fascist regime. 10 years later, Indonesia decided to invade East Timor. At the start of the invasion, August 1975, the following appeal was broadcast by a radio station in East Timor, saying, quote, the Indonesian forces are killing indiscriminately. Women and children are being shot in the streets. We are all going to be killed. This is an appeal for international help. Please do something to stop this invasion, end quote. The Catholic bishop in the town of Dili in East Timor wrote this, quote, the soldiers who landed started killing everyone they could find. There were many dead bodies in the streets. All we could see were soldiers killing, end quote. In one incident, a group of 50 men, women, and children were marched to the side of a cliff. In this same group was one Australian freelance reporter, a man named Roger East. This group was lined up right next to the side of the cliff so that the disposal of their bodies wouldn't be a problem, and they were shot so that they fell into the sea. Current estimates are that in the first 2 days of the East Timor invasion, 2,000 Timorese were massacred. 500 Chinese immigrants were killed at the same time. Now look, I know what you're thinking. These are extreme examples, and almost any government under a military dictatorship, even if it is not considered fascist, will perpetrate outrages like these. And that might be true. So the question naturally arises, is there any such thing as a good fascist government? Well, that depends on what you consider good. Does the economy advance under fascist leadership? Very often. Does the status or power or wealth of a nation increase under fascist leadership? That also is possible. But I have to say that by definition, by its very nature, fascism is inimical to the things that I value. So to me, I don't think there is such a thing as a good fascist regime. Lying and violence and propaganda and suppression of minorities, prohibiting open debate and free discussion, devaluing or suppressing women, suppressing workers' rights, putting the interests of the state above the interests of its individual citizens. No, I don't consider those good things. The interesting thing is a lot of people see dictatorship as synonymous with fascism, but that's not accurate. While I don't favor a dictatorship either, there have at least been good dictators. You could make the argument that Marcus Aurelius, or Simon Bolivar, or Frederick the Great of Prussia, or King Abdullah II, or Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, several caliphs and sultans, you could argue they were motivated by benevolent ideals and wanted the best for their people and achieved that. But that's not fascism. It's not fascism until you get into the demonizing, the victimizing, the violent overthrow of established democratic norms and ideals, the labeling of anyone who disagrees with you as a traitor, the machismo. That's fascism. I don't really know how you could call a fascist regime good, and it's easy to see why the word is just thrown around casually, almost as if it has no meaning. It's just a pejorative. But according to the outline that I presented, some of the common characteristics of fascist regimes and the definition, or as close to a definition of fascism as we can get, you would have to have a very different temperament from that of most people living in the West to think fascism is a good thing. All right, so I'm going to conclude this episode with an extra special bonus content. That is, what is Antifa? If you live in the United States in the year 2020, you've heard that term thrown around ad nauseum. But what is it? Depending on who you talk to, it's everything from the right's boogeyman to scare people, to an ideology, just an idea, right up to a secretly organized, billionaire-funded cabal that is getting on airplanes, in dark clothing, in certain cities, possibly lurking behind every corner, hoping to destroy apple pie, mom, the flag, everything we hold dear. And there's a lot of back and forth on Antifa, depending on which part of the political spectrum you're on. So what is Antifa? Well, however you define its organizational structure, it has some common elements that most experts would agree on. First, it is anti-fascism. Remember, we define fascism as being a far-right political ideology. Antifa then would be on the far left. And remember, we said that left-leaning political movements are defined by valuing the equality of all people. And in its most far left-leaning manifestation, that means anarchism. Since the state is the primary enforcer of human inequality, anarchy would be the only way to achieve radical equality. The historian Mark Bray literally wrote the book on Antifa. His book is called The Anti-Fascist Handbook, Antifa. And he said in a telephone conversation, Antifa is a loose movement of, quote, decentralized revolutionary self-defense opposed to the far right, end quote. So there are several key elements in his definition that shouldn't be overlooked. First, he said it's decentralized. So in other words, it's kind of like the cryptocurrency of political movements. Don't look for any kind of organizational hierarchy. Don't look for a rigid structure, in other words. It's decentralized. He also says that it is revolutionary self-defense. It wants to overthrow whatever social order or political system it considers threatening, which in this case he identifies as the far right. And just like fascism has a history, Antifa or anti-fascism has a history. There were radical leftist groups that resisted Mussolini and resisted Hitler, and Antifa traces its ideological roots back to those groups. In the early 1930s, there was actually a communist-aligned group called the Anti-Fascist Action, and they fought street battles against Hitler's followers until they were disbanded in 1933. If you lived through the 1980s and 1990s, you know that skinheads, neo-Nazis, and fascism was rearing its ugly head once again, all the way from Western Europe, Western Germany, to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. So the Antifa-type tradition rose up again with it. One of the groups was created in the 1980s in Minneapolis called the ARA, the Anti-Racist Action. So essentially, Antifa is a far-left reaction to far-right political movements. And what people find threatening about it is that A, it's anarchist or possibly communist, and B, Antifa as a movement is not pacifist. It accepts the use of violence to achieve political aims. Frankly, I found a lot of mixed messages, mixed information about Antifa when I did this research. What I mean is, I find its ontological status very much in doubt, whether it actually exists as an organization or an entity, or merely as an idea, a concept. In September of the year 2020, FBI Director Christopher Wray says the following, quote, Antifa is more of an ideology than an organization, end quote. Of course, that undercuts some of the statements by the executive branch and others who have claimed that Antifa is a well-defined organization and that it is organizing acts of violence across the nation. President Trump, Attorney General William Barr, Acting Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Mark Morgan have all recently condemned Antifa for flying organized groups to cities across the country to incite violence. Now, I have to say this clearly. I've not been able to find one piece of evidence from any reliable or reputable news source that these kind of claims are true. There is no money trail, there's no document trail, no secret communiques that would back up any kind of claim of some serious organization behind these efforts. In fact, this is how Christopher Wray, again the FBI director, characterized Antifa groups. He said, quote, "We have seen folks who subscribe or identify with the Antifa movement, who coalesce regionally into small groups or nodes, and they are certainly organized at that level," end quote. So again, very decentralized. Wray also said in that same testimony that it is white supremacists that make up the largest portion of lethal extremist attacks. Now, a week or two later, under pressure, obviously, Wray clarified parts of his testimony. He said the same thing in different ways. He says, quote, "Let me try to be as clear as I can about that. Antifa is a real thing. It is not a fiction. We have seen organized tactical activity at the local regional level." He goes on, quote, "We have seen Antifa adherents coalescing and working together in what I would describe as small groups and nodes," end quote. Again, I'm not sure how that clarifies what he said before, but Wray points out that doesn't mean that they couldn't be considered a threat when taken as a whole. He says, quote, "We don't view how nationally organized something is as a proxy for how dangerous it is, end quote. Even if Antifa is not Spectre from the James Bond movies or Hydra from the Marvel comic book movies, as the administration wants to paint it, it can still act out in locally dangerous ways. One example of that is the fact that in Portland, Oregon, recently, a member of Antifa, self-described member of Antifa, Michael Forrest Reinl, shot a member of a far-right militia group, Patriot Prayer, a man named Aaron Danielson, dead. So far I think we can see a pattern of key points. Antifa is locally organized, small nodes or groups. They consider themselves on the far left and primarily oppose the far right by whatever means necessary, which means even including violent means. And finally, even with their self-described acceptance of violent means when necessary, they're not considered as much of a violent threat as white supremacist groups. According to Kenneth Cuccinelli, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, white supremacist groups are responsible for the most lethal attacks in the U.S. in recent years. Quote, white supremacists act as terrorists. More people are killed. That is a higher lethality, end quote. According to Erin Smith, writing in Reason magazine, she is a conservative trans woman who infiltrated an Antifa group in Portland. She said that a lot of the ideas come from a book called Crime Think. That's think with a C, all one word, Crime Think. Kind of like the anarchist cookbook for a new millennium. And according to Smith, quote, basically, they, Antifa, are baiting the police into overreacting. Antifa goes for a certain type of violence, a mid-level violence. Most people aren't practiced in violence, and what they'll do is they'll either back down or they'll overreact. Antifa basically, as a group, does the equivalent of pushing someone on the shoulder again and again, end quote. So it's pretty clear when you're using these kind of tactics, people can get hurt. So we shouldn't underestimate how an otherwise peaceful protest could turn violent and even fatal when people employing Antifa-style tactics show up on the scene. So that's Antifa. Violent, reactionary, revolutionary, far left-leaning, not as violent as white supremacist groups, and not centrally organized. All right, well, thank you for listening. I'm going to close there. This is the History of Being Human podcast. This is not the topic I chose to speak on when I began. This is the rabbit hole we ended up going down. Fascism and Antifa. Feel free to write me at thobhpodcast@gmail.com. thobhpodcast@gmail.com. I'm hoping the next time I'll find the scent again of some of the dumbest things in history. Although maybe fascism is one of the dumbest things in history.